This lecture turns to French painting between 1620 and 1650 with the most influential painter for the French Academy, Nicolas Poussin. Born in 1594, Poussin would become known as the painter-philosopher for his biographers and other writers on art to follow, for his style would be the most influential when the French Academy is established by all those individuals we discussed last time, including Vouet, the Lenon brothers, Champagne, and others. Now, the frontispiece to the life of Poussin by Giovanpietro Bellori is going to showcase that very much unlike, say, Caravaggio, his representation allegorical figure of a woman points to a painting of geometric forms, with the Latin phrase lumen et umbra in the background, or light and shade. Now, this might be interpreted quite simplistically as him being able to represent forms convincingly on a three-dimensional surface, but moves beyond that for Bellori, who includes the artist's own osservazione, or observations on painting at the end of his life. Instead, this should be understood as the philosophical and art theoretical underpinnings of the discipline. Now, most of his professional life will be spent in Rome, and collectors will seek out his works after he establishes his formal style by 1630. Many French artists would seek him out when traveling to Rome and wanted to be trained by him and in his studio. Now, we know that he's born in Normandy and belongs to a prosperous family who fell on hard times during the religious wars, losing their property. His mother, we know interestingly enough, was illiterate, and his education was quite the opposite, being trained for a degree in law. We know that he knew Latin, ancient history, and mythology. This is further bolstered by his very influential friendships with individuals like poets. He decided to pursue painting after watching Quentin Varron, who is going to be active at the turn of the century and primarily practices a Mannerist style. He's working in a local church in 1612 when Poussin realizes his life's passion is to become a painter. Therefore, he is quite old when he goes into the apprenticeship process, much like Leonardo da Vinci. He studies in Paris for a while, and he's given access to the royal collection of Italian art. He then has two failed attempts to reach Rome with royal patronage. He does receive a commission in 1622 for the Jesuit college in Paris, producing 6 tempera paintings that do not survive. It would be his friend Giambattista Marino, the famous epic poet, who would give Poussin room and board and access to his library and art collection, and would be the one to actually finance and launch his career. In fact, the earliest works that we have surviving for Poussin are illustrating the most influential work by Marino, his Le Donne, or the Adonis, a poem elaborating on many themes in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So this is the only work that we have surviving by him before 1624 in good condition. Here we have Orpheus, who's going to be the famous musician whose wife dies, and he travels to the underworld in order to sing and play his lyre to the king and queen of the damned, to have them freed. Surrounding them we have a fantastical invenzione, an assortment of other figures, including Prometheus bound to a rock with Zeus's eagle, and other figures such as Poseidon in the lower left-hand corner, and once again Sisyphus pushing a boulder up to the right. Obviously, these were not part of the original story, but are elaborations, just as Le Donne is a poem that elaborates on various themes in Ovid, not taking from one. Now, his own ideas on art would be published by Bellori in his life, or Vita, in 1672. It was at the beginning of the lives of the artist that Bellori would set out his manifesto and theory for the arts in his essay on the idea of beauty. Here we find that, as we discussed with Annibale Carracci, Poussin can be seen and was held up as a champion of the idea of beauty, one who looks to this world but purifies it with the notion and the access to the supercelestial forms out beyond the moon. beyond the sublunar sphere. And so we use the compass of the intellect seen here to create classicizing paintings and ennobled forms. What is interesting about Poussin is he blooms quite late. He is still a novice painter in his early 30s, a time in which you would have already had Michelangelo having painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling and many others producing their most famous works. Now, he travels to Rome in 1623 and then through Venice with Marino, who is going to pay for and subsidize his travel and study. We know that while in Rome, he's going to see the Vatican Stanze of Raphael and the ancient sculpture collection that so entranced artists who traveled there, those like Bernini and others. But it would be the secretary to Cardinal Francesco Barberini, that being Cassiano del Pazzo, who was the most important patron for Poussin for 2 decades. While in the household of Pazzo, he will study alongside those his similar age of Cortona and Duquesno, where the subjects he produces likewise will be only for the most educated clients. He produces very few public commissions and yet somehow is incredibly influential. Here is one of his early works demonstrating his novice approach to painting. This is the Sack of Jerusalem from 1625 to 26, where the Emperor Titus is going to be shown sacking Judea and bringing back the spoils of war, including the menorah and other items of gold and silver from the temple as it burns in the background. This is the first work for the Barberini, where we see quite awkward proportions of figures in this huge multifigural ensemble. And unfortunately, the perspective is also lacking, which has been pointed out by his contemporaries. So if we were to compare it to another artist working in the same household, Pietro da Cortona, we can see that this interest in antiquarianism is going to be common and carries throughout his career, for his patrons had the same interest, showing ancient structures, in this case, ancient Jerusalem during the time of ancient Rome, just as we have another ancient Roman subject here in the rape of the Sabine women. So we carefully observe these structures and monuments and then reproduce them, casting them in the antiquarian appreciation of the patrons. By 1627, Poussin has grown leaps and bounds and will finalize the style and the composition for which he will become known. In the Death of Germanicus, we have a fairly standard-sized canvas at 58 inches by 78 inches, meant to hang in the interior of a palace. The second work here, produced for the Barberini, is also from ancient Rome, but this time more obscure in its history. For we show the Roman general, an adopted son of Tiberius, is going to be poisoned by the ruler of Syria. Hence we are looking at the death of Germanicus. In it we have the faithful followers of Germanicus, his wife and child, off to the side, all grieving his passing in a carefully observed ancient Roman interior space, which is very Spartan and severe. Agrippina, his wife, is weeping off to his side, where his young son Caligula, the future tyrannical emperor, whose nickname is Little Boots, is going to be holding on to his mother, wearing this blue cloak like a cape. So the formula that we have here for Poussin's work moving forwards is as follows. We have a rectangular composition that draws our eye across instead of up and down. And the figures will be placed in loosely spaced frieze-like compositions across the surface, in this case read from left to right, with the Roman soldiers to the far left weeping into their hands, to his second in command demanding punishment and retribution for what happened, to the women at the far right. So we have an appropriate background for the period in which this takes place, and he will often use a primary color scheme, emphasizing red, yellow, and blue in the balance and the central figures in the composition, with a range of affetti or affectations, these emotions, from the men who demand revenge and action to the women who succumb to their emotions. This is in fact going to be the model for neoclassical art and painters like David in the late 18th century, where we have the ideal for masculinity being action. We have active revenge being sought by the men, with passive resignation defining the reactions of the women as they crumble into themselves in closed compositions, whereas the men, virile and muscular, are in open compositions, pointing up, demanding a justice. The composition and the subject, interestingly enough, through emulatio, can be seen to come from the Meleager sarcophagus showing the death of Meleager, a very famous scene from antiquity, where we have the death of a hero. Here, being read by these monumental figures arranged from left to right as we move through the sarcophagus, we can see how this man on a deathbed would have provided a model for Poussin and later neoclassical painters looking to classical models. So we know that Poussin, like Duquesneau as well, who he's working with, carefully studies antiquity. And this is a type of neoclassicism that predates the 18th century, where they carefully deconstruct and copy these ancient forms, especially Greek works, which are preferred for their precision. In fact, the difference between Greek and Roman classicism can also be shown between the difference in French and Italian classicism. For the French prefer a much more restrained, somber, and one style that is going to be emphasized by closed contours and sober expressions, versus the Roman or Italian model, which are going to be overt shows of emotion, open compositions, and once again, excess. So Greek classicism is going to be used here by Poussin and later David to revive neoclassicism in figures that are very clear. The compositions are read like a classical relief frieze. The subject is didactic and is going to be easily understandable and comprehensible by way of the affetti and the gestures with the figures here, whether that be the death of Socrates and him defying the Athenian council to his last breath, or the followers of Germanicus seeking blood. Turning to his one major public commission, which was an altarpiece for New St. Peter's, the Martyrdom of St. Erasmus, a massive painting at 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, produced between 1620 and 29, we have as the subject Erasmus, who's the Bishop of Antioch, whose execution is ordered by Diocletian in 303 Common Era. As part of the execution, his belly is cut open and his intestines wound around a windlass. We see that the pagan priest is going to be pointing, standing over Erasmus, pointing back to a statue of Hercules that he demands him worship, this pagan god, whereas the bishop's mitre is cast to the side here, identifying him as a bishop, appropriate for New St. Peter's, which is where the head bishop, the Pope, has his throne. The subject is shown most commonly in northern art. It is not common in Italy, but very often this grotesque punishment is going to be maximized for its dramatic impact on the viewer. This would have been compared to another painting produced at the same time and is of a similar format and design, the Valentin de Boulogne we looked at. So with Boulogne's, we have figures that are arranged at a diagonal, right? The Saints Processus especially is going to be shown in the same position as Erasmus, where an angel comes down to hand him a martyr's palm, just as two angels are flying down to crown, once again, Erasmus as a saint and give him his martyr's palm. Now, these were compared by Joachim von Sandrart, a northern biographer, who stated that Poussin's work is appreciated for its clear affetti. It is a bright work, and its gestures and the emotions of the figures are quite clear. Everyone points, grimaces, and or scowls in an appropriate fashion, whereas Boulogne's is going to be appreciated for its rustic and robust naturalism and Caravagismo. The precedent that we have here for Poussin, again, comes from the very influential Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine by Veronese, where we have a diagonal composition which is anchored by two fluted Corinthian columns off to the side. In this case, we do not have the swath of fabric, but instead the statue of Hercules identifying the background, leading us through from the main figure, for Veronese being St. Catherine, up to the Virgin Mary and Christ, and finally to heaven. Whereas with Poussin, we are going to be looking at the pained expression of Erasmus, who is going through a brutal execution, through the gesture that is pointing back to Hercules of this priest. Now, after this work, he receives no other public commissions in Rome, and the reason why can be seen here. It is criticized for its anatomical inaccuracies. Poussin is not a master of anatomy, though it is said he attended drawing lessons in the city. We do not have nude figures that are based on actual plebeian types in his work. He will continue to base his on statuary from this point onward, and working only for private patron. This would be the case from 1630 onwards, where he begins to work for private patrons such as Fabrizio Valguarnera, with two large works for the Sicilian merchant, which was actually used to launder money through the art commissions that he's going to pay for. We know that Poussin testifies at his trial, thus of course giving us insight into these works as well and their origin. Supposedly in Poussin's studio, Valguarnera will see these works unfinished and then urges Poussin to finish and then buy them. So when the first work is finished, Poussin suggests a second work of his own design. Here we have the Plague of Ashdod from 1629 to 30, one of the first in two works for the Sicilian merchant, showing us this devastating plague discussed in the Old Testament. Now, we can see that, unlike a work from just 3 years earlier, that he has mastered his perspective, and his multifigural compositions are much more believable and are designed after he had seen other works in the city, such as that by Domenichino and the Flagellation of St. Andrew, where we have figures lined up across the front of the composition towards the picture plane, very clearly moving in one direction. So we know how everyone is reacting and what is happening, set within an appropriate backdrop of classical antiquity. The other painting that Poussin suggests that he be produced for and as a pendant to the Plague of Ashdod is the Realm of Flora from 1630 to 31. In this painting it is quite different, noticeably so, and purposefully so, because it shows the etymological birth of different flowers. Where do they come from according to classical antiquity? So we have no single literary source which helps us identify the realm of Flora. Instead, he combines in the Ovidian style and Marino's poetry this garden imagery in an invenzione, or an imaginative, inventive scene, bringing together many different motifs. This is just like Domenichino's archery contest that we discussed, that has no one singular literary source, but instead conflates several. Most notably the death of Actaeon, the archery contest of Diana and her nymphs, and the burial of Anchises in the Aeneid. So these two different works are for the same patron, but are in different modes. So modes are an appropriate fashion which are derived from music and literature, and would set the tone or the mood for a particular genre. So in a letter to Chanteloup, another one of his patrons, Poussin outlines and states, "Do you not see that in nature of the subject that lies the cause of this effect, and that subjects which I am treating for you have to be done in a different manner?" What he's referring to are the modes discussed in, say, Virgil's poetry, where we have appropriate moods that are set using different words, language, and a cadence or rhythm in a poem. For painting, these are going to come over as Dorian for grave and severe subjects, Phrygian for those that are clear-cut, such as scenes of war, Lydian for tragic subjects, and then Hippolydian for those that are sweet. So this can be seen in art, as we've discussed it, to where the early style of Annibale Carracci is reflective and somber, so an appropriate style would be used to show the tragic death of Christ, versus one that is bright, because it is a didactic scene, where we have the Domine Quo Vadis, or Lord, where do you go, where St. Peter is going to come in contact with the resurrected Christ. So we have two different purposes, one to teach and one to reflect on. So we have two different styles, two different lighting effects and color schemes. Now, as a background to why these paintings are made and how they relate to contemporary events, a plague breaks out in Italy and ravages the entire peninsula between 1629 and 31. So the more common type of painting that would be produced in this instance would be a votive offering, like the Palla della Peste we talked about with Guido Reni, where you would have plague saints or showing the plague in order to offset and or to prevent the spread of it. Here, instead of a Sacra Conversazione, Poussin shows us a scene from antiquity, where God's wrath is going to be wrought on these peoples as the Philistines capture the ark, seen here in the temple to the left with the angel's wings interlocking, this being the temple of Dagon. So the statue of this pagan god has fallen over and is broken, his hand and his head fallen to the second tier of this temple. The ark, the fallen statue, and the rats all are indicators of God's presence and what is happening here, that being a plague is being sent to punish the Philistines and their actions, and the theft of the ark. So here we have the sky being overcast and a Doric order, if you look at the buildings to the back right, being shown, which is appropriate for a severe and serious scene. That's where we have Sebastiano Serlio in Architectura. This book, published in 1551, is going to state that the Doric order is appropriate for tragedy. Now, where does he get the motifs here, though, in the foreground, with the dead mother and child, or the man covering his mouth, or the one bending over to grab the child who is tugging at his dead mother? These come from, these anecdotal details, from Raphael's drawing of the plague at Phrygia. So we know that he's bringing in this emulatio, figures from different artists. Now, turning to the realm of Flora in 1630 to 31, following this tragedy, we have one in a very bright key that's set in a garden that is in the bright sunshine. We find that all the figures present are taken from different literary accounts. Above, we have Apollo illuminating the scene on his quadriga or four-horse chariot, drawing the light into the scene. At the far left, appropriate for a garden because it flourishes with new life, you have Priapus, the god of fertility, usually shown with an enlarged phallus. Below him, we have Ajax committing suicide after being denied the armor of Achilles. Narcissus is going to be looking into his reflection here in the water next to him, while Primavera, the goddess of spring, is sprinkling flowers about the scene here. Next to her, Hyacinth is going to be bleeding flowers from his fatal head wound, as Apollo, his lover, had thrown a discus at Winterray and struck him in the head. Adonis, the lover of Venus, is going to be shown here with his hunting dogs and the wound in his leg that's going to be spilling flowers out, showing us the etiological origin of these flowers, while Cupid and Psyche are in embrace in the lower right-hand corner. The figures are all going to be suffering tragic ends, but this is going to belie that assorted tragedy in this lyrical mood, because this is showing us how all these flowers are explained by ancient Greek mythology. Where do they come from? Often from tragedy and death, but it's shown in a lyrical and a very light-hearted fashion. So if we were to look at the moods of these two, we would say that the overall mood or mode used here would be Hippolydian for the realm of Flora, because it is sweet, soft, and brightly lit. It is a flower or a floral scene, whereas the plague at Ashdod is grave and severe and shows a tragedy, so more appropriately the Dorian mode is going to be used. With the next work, we find that moving into the late 1630s and 1640s, Poussin will produce more paintings with figures in movement in large multifigural compositions, still deriving the subject matter from antiquity and mythology. In this work, which was produced for Cardinal Richelieu, we have an unclear subject, for it references many works in this emulatio, emulating these various predecessors. So we know that it centers on Venus, the goddess of love, as she's riding these dolphins to shore on the seashell, with Neptune, the god of the sea, with his quadriga, the four-horse chariot here to the left, with Cupid in a chariot in the background to the left, with white doves, the symbol for Venus, pulling his chariot along. We know we also have Amphitrite and Galatea shown off to the right. So we know the subject has something to do with love and marriage, for Amphitrite, the wife of Neptune, is going to be the only one pursued by the god of the sea. The figures here, especially the dorsal view of the woman in the lower right, is going to be taken from and inspired by Raphael's painting in the Loggia of Psyche, whereby we have a very similar pose and are meant to compare the two. As well, the painting is modeled on Raphael's Galatea and does include her to the right, but replaces the main subject instead with Venus. Interestingly, Raphael's scene also was originally intended to be a birth of Venus, but was changed at the request of the patron. Now, the subject would inevitably remind one of the monumental Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli from 1482, because she also is going to be presented in the center with this diaphanous drapery over her and riding on the seashell. So the subject brings together many different elements and is meant to make you compare them. They are modeled on them, and so we are expected as a very discerning and crafty viewer to understand the interpictorial references here. So we know that looking at ancient Greek statuary and the old masters, we have a combination here, an emulatio, where we are going to have Poussin competing with these predecessors, putting multiple scenes together into one, just like we have the Invenzione in the realm of Flora. In 1638 through 48, we know that he produces two sets of the seven sacraments for Cassiano del Pazzo and Paul Fréart de Chanteloup. These two patrons, after seeing the first one, request a second one that is ordered. Chanteloup gets the second version. Now, the subject of the seven sacraments is rarely ever depicted except in early Netherlandish painting. It certainly is very, very rare in Italy. For the sacraments are confirmation, ordination, penance, baptism, Eucharist, marriage, and the extreme unction. Here we have Roger van der Weyden showing all seven of them in this triptych. So we know that Poussin chooses episodes in the life of Christ for all of them, but the confirmation and extreme unction. They all express, regardless, this antiquarian interest in daily life in ancient Rome, being carefully observed in an antiquarian fashion. So we know that Cassiano is going to have commissioned drawings of the remnants of these Roman monuments in the Roman civilization from Pietro da Cortona earlier in the century. Now, antiquarianism is quite common among these wealthy patrons in Rome and is a general interest in all things antique, Grecian or Roman. Here in the extreme unction from 1638 to 40, we have the last of the seven sacraments being shown in a standard home in ancient Rome. Its historical accuracy has been noted and is taken from these drawings and Poussin's own research. So an ordinary Roman citizen's house would have a similar height to the ceiling, shutters for the windows, and then the same type of dress. The subject of the extreme unction is more commonly known as the last rites. We've seen this before with Dominicanos, last communion of St. Jerome, where someone is anointed with oil on their eyes and forehead and is given the final Eucharist, so the final communion wafer and wine before death. So here we have the final anointing, in which we have part of the extreme unction, a series of actions which must take place, including penance and then the Vatican. Now the light that's filtering in through the window is fading, which is a metaphor for the fading life of man, and this man especially. But we all will die. So we have the candle held up for the priest delivering the extreme unction and the anointing here, whereas the organization is very logical and maintains that rectangular format he prefers late in his career. The primary color scheme of red, yellow, and blue is maintained in the foreground, as is the very logical presentation of what the subject is, everything centered on and turning towards the dying man. The format of the rectangular grouping of figures from the classical relief frieze, which we first saw in the death of Germanicus, is carried on all the way through the end of his career and will become the foundation for history paintings in the French Academy. The figures, once again, are comprehensible only after looking at all of them to see how they are reacting. Variously, just like in the death of Germanicus, the priest calmly anoints the dying man, where those look on in awe, or the women in the background wring their hands together, or cast their bodies at the feet of this man. So unlike the extreme unction, the counterpart, the ordination, as part of the second set produced for Chanteloup, contrasts an interior scene with an exterior scene, a dimly lit room with the bright light of day, and an emphatic primary color scheme can be seen in both. In the ordination, taken from an episode from the life of Christ, we have the moment where Christ is going to give the keys to the kingdom of heaven and earth to St. Peter, selecting him to be the vicar of Christ to carry on his message and his role on earth, while the other 11 apostles look on surrounding him, in again a primary color scheme. Now, there is a massive column next to Christ that he is pointing to with an E on it for ecclesia, which is church in Latin. It is also reference to the funerary marker for St. Peter's body, or Petrus, a stone, for St. Peter, or Pietra in Italian, means stone. For on that stone, Christ says he will build his church. So we find that this is the marker that would lead to the foundation of and building of old St. Peter's, as identified by Pope Sylvester and by Constantine. The buildings surrounding them, importantly, are those around the Vatican, as described by Antonio Bossio in Roma Saturnia from 1632, stating what the structures would have looked like around St. Peter's and the Vatican. So we have the bridge near the Castel San Angelo, right behind Christ's head, and off to the right, the pyramid shape of the tomb of Scipio Africanus, appropriate for this general in Africa to have a tomb in Rome that looks like a pyramid, since it references Egypt. Here are the photographs of those identifying the structures they're referring to, right next to the Vatican, and here we have right down the road. You would have seen this pyramid of Scipio. The first set, just to show the difference, illustrates the evolution that took place not only with Poussin, but earlier with Annibale Carracci. For we have the same scene with Christ all the way at the left, handing the keys to the kneeling St. Peter wearing this orange cloak, while the others look on. Behind Judas's head, we have a dead tree, showing he will bring death. So showing the two together, we have the development of these classical compositions and style, the same as Annibale, as instead of moving in one direction with a more rustic color scheme and a Venetian color scheme, we now use a bright local key and color palette to bring our eye to the center in this triangular composition. Annibale had the same transition from the more dramatic, ruddy color scheme and composition that he learned while studying Venetian art to the classicizing approach with the bright color scheme and local palette that he adopted after seeing classical works in Rome. The same subject can be seen here with the Assumption of the Virgin we looked at earlier, illustrating this transformation. Now, another patron who commissions a work from Poussin, he actually owned 21 other works, Jean Pointel, who was a very wealthy banker, wishes to have a painting that would rival the very popular Sewing School by Guido Reni, where we had the Virgin and 8 companions illustrating different types of female beauty, so comparing different types of women. So for Poussin, he commissions this work to compare to this. That is the Rebecca and Eliezer at the Well from 1648, where we find the marriage proposal of Eliezer for his master is going to be presented with many other women surrounding them, 12 in all appropriately. So this is the marriage proposal offered by Isaac, the son of Abraham. And we find here that we have a prefiguration of Christ as well. In earlier works, it is more common to see the offering of water by Rebecca, which is how Eliezer knows she will make a good wife, for she is kind to a stranger, and or the promise to return with his master, Isaac. Now, later in the century, it is more common to show the marriage proposal. In the scene, we have the hand of Rebecca over her chest, hearing the news that she is to marry Isaac, while other women carrying different vases look on. Now, this comes from Agnolo Firenzuola's tract on the beauty of women, published in 1548, which is explaining how vases represent the different ideal shapes of women. For the idea of the perfect shape is shown in the amphora she carries. These other vases, as described by Firenzuola, are less desirable. These different shapes are less desirable. Now, in Petrarchan love poetry, going back to Petrarch and Dante, a woman's neck is seen to be the most important facet and characteristic related to female beauty. And so women very often are shown carrying vases. And from antiquity in ancient Greece, a woman is known as a vase or a vessel in many ways. So the various vessels that are identified here come from antiquity and ancient Greek vases and vase painting. So the variety that Petrarch and also Firenzuola are identifying are going to be taken from these earlier classical models. Now we have 12 women here, and that should not surprise one that it's meant to be compared to the 12 apostles. So this is an Old Testament companion or prefiguration to this New Testament scene with the ordination. So whereas Eliezer promising Isaac and his hand to Rebecca at the well is going to be seen as a prefiguration of the Annunciation and also the giving of the keys to St. Peter, for it promises something new to come. Now the women at the left are in red and yellow, which are the traditional colors also of Saints Peter and Paul. Therefore, we know that we're comparing them coloristically as well as thematically. Importantly as well, behind the women are domestic buildings versus the public sphere of life we see in downtown Rome behind the men, an appropriate division between the two genders as seen at the time. Now here, do we have in fact idealized female beauty as in Guido Reni's example without overt eroticism, such as in Domenichino's archery contest where we have nude women shown in the foreground of the painting, very obviously overtly erotic? And this could be the case, we do not know. Comparing it to Guido Reni's, though, we know that overt sensuality, especially of the female form, is outside of his purview and is not seen in his oeuvre. And so we find that these two paintings are meant to be compared and to compete with one another. The final painting we will look at for Poussin represents the end of his career, one of his most famous works, Et in Arcadia Ego of 1655. In it we have the style that would be carried on in the second half of the 17th century by the followers of Poussin in Charlebrun and others. The scene is very popular and seen throughout Italy and France, where Et in Arcadia Ego translates even in Arcadia I am. And so we often show these shepherds coming upon a tomb, sarcophagus, or skull, as in Guercino's example here, pondering what it could possibly mean. For we are in Arcadia, or Elysium, paradise, which is going to be populated by shepherds, sheep, and heroes. But even in paradise, death exists. We see here Poussin early in his career with his Venetian mode and style, showing the figures at a diagonal, reading the words, pondering them, confused at what is also with them in Arcadia. What is death? They do not understand what it is in paradise. And so it is being explained here by this figure generally interpreted as death herself. The figures, though, you'll notice, are going to be in a primary color scheme of red, yellow, and blue, and they are distilled on this stage-like space right behind the picture plane with the landscape as a backdrop, much like the later hyperclassicizing style of Annibale Carracci. Here we have the modes or types being appropriate, for we are considering mortality itself. And so we have the figures, one currently reading the words, running his fingers across the sunken relief of Et in Arcadia Ego here on the sarcophagus, another waiting to read off to the left, and the shepherd with a red cloak asking what it means, having just read it to this female figure who has her hand on his shoulder. The affetti and the expressions are quite appropriate, for we know what each one is doing, comprehending, reading, questioning, and explaining. So this very logical approach to composition, the clarity of the design, and the classical nature of the subject all will be the model for the French Academy. So next time we will turn to that with French landscape painting in the Academy with Claude Lorrain and Charles Lebrun.